Hello everyone, welcome to week 7. Our goal for this week is to build off of the concepts that we looked at last week. We're going to take those standard form categorical propositions that we learned about last week and construct syllogistic arguments from them. Let's start with trying to understand what a categorical syllogism actually is. So a categorical syllogism is just an argument that has two premises and one conclusion, and it's constructed out of categorical propositions. Those propositions we learned about in week 6, we're just taking them and arranging them in an argument form that has two premises and one conclusion. So I have an example here of a standard form categorical syllogism. All soldiers are patriots, no traitors are patriots, therefore no traitors are soldiers. So the first two statements are the premises, and then the last statement is the conclusion. Now this argument contains a premise indicator word, therefore. Usually in standard form a categorical syllogism won't contain that premise indicator word. It'll just be the categorical proposition itself. A lot of times there's a line drawn between the premises and the conclusion to indicate that a conclusion follows, but always the third statement will be the conclusion. Okay, so we have to understand the conditions that determine a standard form categorical syllogism. In other words, the rules that tell us when we have a categorical syllogism in standard form. So let's go through those. So condition 1 is that all three statements must be standard form categorical propositions. So the kind of propositions we learned about last week, we remember all the criteria for standard form. You have to have a quantifier, all, no, or some. You have to have a copula, are or are not. You have to have a noun or a noun phrase in the subject and predicate positions. All those rules. Those were the rules that constructed standard form categorical propositions. We use those rules to construct those propositions, and then we construct arguments out of them. So the first rule then is all three statements of a categorical syllogism have to be standard form categorical propositions. Second rule, the two occurrences of each term are identical. So what that means is that if a term occurs in one place in an argument, it has to be stated identically in another place in the argument. So the term soldiers occurs in their subject position in the first premise, and it also occurs down here in the conclusion in the predicate position. So soldiers is stated exactly the same way. In other words, there aren't extra words added to it that change its structure. Second rule then, just to reiterate, is that the two occurrences of each term have to be identical. And you see that in this categorical syllogism. Soldiers and soldiers is identical, patriots and patriots, traitors and traitors. Okay, so our third rule or condition for a standard form categorical syllogism is that each term is used in the same sense throughout the argument. So what that means is that the word in one occurrence in the argument can't represent something different in reality than the word in another occurrence in the argument. So going back to our example here, all soldiers are patriots, no traitors are patriots, therefore no traitors are soldiers. The word soldier in the first premise has to refer to the same things in the world, in other words, mean the same thing as the word soldier down here, and the same for all the other terms. Patriots has to mean the same thing as patriots here, and traitors has to mean the same thing as traitors here. Okay, so each term is used in exactly the same sense throughout the argument. And then finally, our fourth condition, or fourth rule here, is that the major premise is listed first, the minor premise second, and the conclusion last. So the major premise is on the top, the minor premise is the second statement, and then in the conclusion, the minor term is the subject of the conclusion, and the major term is the predicate of the conclusion. And so you just have to arrange them based on the conclusion, essentially, whatever word falls in the subject position in the conclusion is the minor term, and you know that wherever the minor term occurs in the premises, that statement must be the second premise, not the first, and then the major term must be the one that occurs in the first premise. Now, this is not super important. You can still apply most of the rules of evaluation that we'll learn later. Even if you have the premises out of order, you would still be able to identify the arguments as valid or invalid, and that's our ultimate goal, is to be able to evaluate these arguments for validity and invalidity. But you could go wrong in terms of what fallacy you say that these particular arguments commit, if they are committing a fallacy, if you don't have your minor term, major term, and your premises in the right location. And we'll see that when we look at our rules for evaluation here in a little while. Okay, so those are our 4 requirements for standard form categorical proposition. I'm not going to require you to construct categorical syllogisms and put them into standard form. I will already construct them and put them into standard form. You're just going to be asked to evaluate them for validity or invalidity using the rules of evaluation. Okay, so let's handle mood and figure now. So the mood of a categorical syllogism consists of the letter names that make it up. So this is pretty simple. Remember, I told you that logicians in the Middle Ages used the vowels A, E, I, and O to represent the 4 standard form categorical propositions. So an A form categorical proposition is all S's or P's. A no form is no S's or E form is no S's or P's. An I form is some S's or P's, and an O form is some S's or not P. So it's just a shorthand way of constructing arguments. So an AAA categorical syllogism would just be a categorical syllogism that's constructed with all A form categorical propositions, meaning all S's or P type propositions. AIO would be a categorical syllogism that has an A form categorical proposition in the first premise, an I form categorical proposition in the second, and O form for the conclusion, and so forth. So mood is just this symbolic way of showing the structure of the categorical syllogism itself. Now, the figure is determined by the location of the 2 occurrences of the middle term. So the middle term is the term that occurs in both of the premises of the argument of a categorical syllogism. In other words, it's the term that's shared between the 2 premises. And there's 4 ways you could arrange that shared term. If you look down here in this chart, in a figure 1 type categorical syllogism, the middle term would occur in the subject slot in the first premise and the predicate slot in the second. And then in figure 2, the middle term occurs in both premises in the predicate slot. Figure 3, both of them occur in the subject slot. And figure 4, premise 1, the middle term would occur in the predicate slot and then in the subject slot in the second premise. So these are just ways of determining or representing where the middle term is occurring in the 2 premises. Okay, so that's a mood and figure. Now, once we understand that, understand those structures, you can actually construct charts that show which mood and figure combinations are valid and invalid. So there are 256 ways that you can construct categorical syllogisms using categorical propositions, but only 24 of them are actually valid and only 15 are unconditionally valid. So this first chart shows those first 15 that are unconditionally valid. So what this means then is, for example, an AAA type argument that has a figure 1 arrangement for its middle term is unconditionally valid. And the same thing goes for all these other combinations. So you could just look at this chart. If you are looking at a categorical syllogism, you can just look at this chart and see if it meets any of these figure and mood combinations, and you would know whether the argument is valid or invalid. If it doesn't meet any of them, and it would be considered to be an invalid argument. If it does, then it's valid. Now, there are these others that are conditionally valid, part of these 24 that are valid. So these are conditionally valid based on how you interpret one of the categorical propositions in these particular structures. And we'll look at this in more detail when we look at our rules for validity here in a second. But depending on how you interpret the premise in these forms of arguments will determine how whether you decide they're valid or invalid. And this is all a result of two different interpretations of what an I-form categorical proposition represents. Remember, an I-form categorical proposition is a sum S's or P. So there was a logician named George Boole. He thought that a sum S's or P type proposition, an I-form proposition, could not did not refer to an object in the actual world, so it didn't have existential import. So if you put a sum on the front of it, he thought it wasn't referring to something out there in reality. And so we'll see why that's important later on. Aristotle disagreed with him on that. Under certain circumstances, Aristotle thought that a I-form categorical syllogism could refer to something in the actual world. And so there's a disagreement about what the correct interpretation is. So there are two different ways you can do this, and we'll see that here just briefly in a second. Okay, so those are our two charts that show validity. So technically, when I give you categorical syllogisms to evaluate for validity or invalidity, you could just look at these charts and determine whether or not they are valid or invalid. Sorry, I keep slipping around between these slides. So now there's actually an easier, shorter way of determining validity and invalidity of categorical syllogisms, and that's to learn the rules of evaluation. So there are 5 rules that we can use to evaluate a categorical syllogism for validity and invalidity. And I want you to be able to manage these and apply them, to understand them and apply them on a quiz. So it's important that we go through them and learn them clearly. So what I'm going to give you here is the Boolean interpretation. In other words, these first 5 ways that we're going to look at categorical syllogism could be fallacious will be the interpretation that George Boole accepted, not Aristotle's interpretation. Now, Aristotle and George Boole agreed on the first 4 rules, but they didn't agree on the last one, and we'll see that when we get to that slide. Okay, so rule 1 is that the middle term must be distributed at least once. So what does that mean? It means that when we look at a categorical syllogism and we're evaluating it for validity or invalidity, we first identify the middle term and the premises. So remember, the middle term is the term that's shared between the two premises, and in this example it's the word fish. And so we ask ourselves, is distribution taking place in one of those instances? Now remember, when we learned about categorical propositions last week, we learned what terms are distributed in what kind of categorical propositions and which ones aren't. So if you remember, in an A-form categorical proposition, and that's what we're dealing with here, all these statements are A-form categorical propositions, including the conclusion, obviously, that in an A-form categorical proposition, the subject term is distributed, meaning we're making a claim about every member of the class of those things. So in this statement, we're making a claim about every shark. We're not making a claim about every fish. We're making a claim about every salmon, but we're not making a claim about every fish. So what that means is the subject term here is distributed in both of these propositions, sharks and salmon, but fish is not distributed because it's in the predicate slot. So the rule says that the middle term must be distributed at least once, and since distribution is not taking place in the predicate position in either of these propositions, it means that we are lacking distribution in our middle term. So if that's the case, the argument commits the fallacy of undistributed middle term, or the short way of saying that is undistributed middle. So this argument that I've given you here would be fallacious because it violates Rule 1. Now we're going to see 4 more rules, and if any single rule is violated, we would say the entire argument is invalid. For an argument to be valid, it has to conform to every rule, all 5 at the same time. Okay, let's move to Rule 2. Rule 2, if a term is distributed in the conclusion, then it must be distributed in a premise. So if you have distribution down in the conclusion occurring, then you have to have the same term being distributed in the premises. So for Rule 2, the first thing you do is you look at your conclusion and you see if you have distribution occurring. And so remember about our standard form categorical propositions. In an O form categorical proposition, and that's what we're dealing with here, some dogs are not animals, the predicate position is distributed, meaning that the word animals has distribution. So according to our rule, if there's distribution down here in the conclusion, we have to have distribution occurring up in the premises. So we look up and find animals in the premises, and that term is not distributed because it's falling in the predicate position of an A form categorical proposition. So since we have distribution in our conclusion but not in our premises, we'd say that the argument is invalid. And it commits the fallacy of illicit major because the major term, that's the second term in the conclusion, the one that's in the predicate slot, that major term is distributed down in the conclusion, but it's not distributed in the premises, so that's why it's called illicit major. Now, the same thing is going on with the second conclusion, second argument, except for there's a different term that's distributed in this argument. So if we look at the second argument, all tigers are mammals, all mammals are animals, therefore all animals are tigers, we find that distribution is occurring in the subject slot. And so we look up at our premises and we find the word animals, and since it's occurring in the predicate slot, we know that distribution is not taking place, so we know immediately the argument's invalid. But since it's the minor term, it's the subject term in the conclusion that's distributed, but not in the premises, we would say that the fallacy of illicit minor is committed here. And so it's labeled illicit minor and illicit major based on whether the distribution is occurring in the conclusion, what slot, subject or predicate, and not in the premises. Okay, so that's Rule 2. The term is distributed in the conclusion, and it must be distributed in the premises. Rule 3, 2 negative premises are not allowed. So you can't have, remember we learned that our categorical propositions can be negative or affirmative in their quality. And so if there's a no that occurs anywhere in those propositions, and we know that they're negative, if there's not a no, then they're affirmative. So both of these premises are negative. We have a no here and we have a not here. And so the rule says you can't have 2 negative premises. So if we had 2 nots or 2 no's on the quantifier location here, the same thing would be the case. You'd have 2 negative premises. So this is a pretty easy rule to apply. 2 negative premises are not allowed. And so if you have 2 negative premises in a categorical syllogism, then we say that it commits the fallacy of exclusive premise. Okay, so just to reiterate what's going on, so you would go through each of these rules when you're given a categorical syllogism, and you'd see if it was violated. You'd first look to see if the middle term is distributed, that's Rule 1. If it passes that rule, you go to Rule 2. If it's distributed in the conclusion, it must be distributed in the premises. It passes that rule, you go to Rule 3. If there are 2 negative premises, then you know it's invalid, committing the fallacy of exclusive premise, and so on. Okay, so Rule 4. A negative premise requires a negative conclusion, and a negative conclusion requires a negative premise. Okay, so if you have a no or not in the premises, you have to have a no or not in the conclusion. That's what the rule is telling us. And if you have a no or not in the conclusion, you have to have a no or not somewhere in the premises. So if we look at this argument, all crows are birds, some wolves are not crows, therefore some wolves are birds. we find that we have a negative in the premises. There's a not here, but we don't have a negative down here in the conclusion. There's no negative quality down here in the some wolves or birds proposition. So the rule says a negative premise requires a negative conclusion. We're not meeting that requirement. So what we're doing is we're drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise. Conclusion's affirmative. The premises, one of the premises is negative, so we're guilty of fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise. And the same thing can happen in reverse, drawing a negative conclusion from affirmative premises. So if your no or not is down here and you don't have a no or not up here, you're drawing a negative conclusion from an affirmative premises. So when you go to Rule 4, all you're really doing is checking to see if you have a no or not up in the premises and a no or not down in the conclusion. And depending on where the no or not occurs, it would determine whether you're committing the first version or the second version of this fallacy. So Rule 4, I think, is pretty straightforward too. Now Rule 5 is a little more complicated. It's not conceptually complicated, but what makes it difficult is that there are two different interpretations of Rule 5, the Aristotelian interpretation and the Boolean interpretation. So Rule 5 says that if both premises are universal, the conclusion cannot be particular. So we know from what we learned about categorical propositions last week, if you have the quantifier all or no, would work with no here also, then you have a universal form proposition. Those are universal quantifiers. But if you have a sum on the front, you're dealing with a particular type proposition. It's got a quantity that's particular. It's referring to just at least one thing, not all of those things. So the rule says that if you have two universal premises, you can't have a particular conclusion, so you can't have an all-sum combination. You can have an all-no sum combination. You have to have a universal conclusion if you have universal premises. That's the only way to keep from violating Rule 5. So what makes this a little more difficult, that in and of itself is pretty easy to spot. You just look for universal in the premises and see if it matches up in the conclusion. If it doesn't, it commits the existential fallacy. But what makes it a little more difficult is the disagreement that Aristotle and George Boole have about how to interpret these sum-type propositions, an I-form categorical proposition. So what Boole said is this sort of structure is always fallacious. Anytime you have two universal premises and a particular conclusion, the argument is going to be fallacious no matter what. It will always commit the existential fallacy. What Aristotle said is that the argument is fallacious if the critical term fails to denote at least one existing thing, otherwise it's valid. So what does that mean, critical term fails to denote? It means that the term that is important in the premise, the one that you're trying to prove something about, that's the critical term. That term, you would ask yourself, does it refer or not to an actual thing in the world? So in this case, tigers are actual things in the world. So since in this conclusion, the word tiger refers to things that actually exist in the world, Aristotle would say that the existential fallacy is not committed. It's okay to go from universal to particular as long as the thing that you're referring to is an actual existing thing. So on the other hand, if I were to plug in, say, unicorns instead of tigers, then our evaluation of that argument would change according to the Aristotelian interpretation. Since tigers exist but unicorns don't, if we interchange unicorns with tigers, the argument becomes fallacious because our critical term fails to denote an existing thing. There aren't really unicorns out there in the world. So this is not too complicated. If I ask you to evaluate categorical syllogism based on Rule 5, the first thing you do is you would just check, okay, do I have two universal premises and a particular conclusion? If you do, it commits the existential fallacy according to the Boolean interpretation. But if I ask you to evaluate it in relation to the Aristotelian interpretation, you would just ask yourself, does the critical term, the thing we're trying to prove something about, does that critical term actually refer to something that exists out in the world? So if it does, then it's not guilty of the existential fallacy. The argument is not guilty of the existential fallacy. If it doesn't refer to something that exists in the actual world, then the argument is guilty of the existential fallacy, like the tigers and unicorn example. Now, sometimes people have a hard time determining what the critical term is. It usually seems fairly obvious by looking at the argument structure, but there is a rule for determining what the critical term is. If you look up in your premises and you figure out what terms are distributed and which ones aren't. So in this case, mammals is distributed, right, because it occurs in the subject position of the first statement of the argument. If you have extra distribution or superfluous distribution, a term that's up in your premises that's distributed but doesn't need to be distributed in order for the argument to be valid according to all the other rules, then that term is going to be your critical term. So up here, we look in our second premise, we see that tigers is distributed, but we don't need tigers to be distributed to keep from violating any of the other rules of evaluation. So it's superfluously or extra distributed, and so that's always going to be the critical term. But generally, it's not that hard to look at an argument and figure out what the critical term is. Okay, so that's Rule 5 and the two ways that we can interpret it, George Boole's way and Aristotle's way. Now, let's talk a little bit about ordinary language arguments. The ultimate goal is to take ordinary language, just the way that people speak in everyday life, and convert that language into standard form categorical propositions, and then arrange it into a categorical syllogism, and then you could use these 5 rules to evaluate ordinary language claims or state arguments for validity and invalidity. So I'm not going to ask you to do this on the actual quiz. It's kind of complicated and takes a lot of practice to get good at this, but I will include an extra credit question where I ask you to do this. So let's just look at how it might work in an example here, so to give you an idea of how to do it in the extra credit question. So we have 3 statements here, basically ordinary language statements. All times people delay marriage, comma, the divorce rate decreases. All present times are times people delay marriage. Therefore, all present times are times the divorce rate decreases. Now, these last 2 statements, premise 2 and the conclusion, are in standard form, so you don't have to worry about them. Right? They have an all-knower sum as a quantifier. The subject and predicate are nouns or noun phrases. There's a copula R that separates the subject and the predicate. So we're meeting all of our criteria in these 2 statements, the bottom 2. But if you look at the first premise here, all times people delay marriage, comma, the divorce rate decreases. That's clearly not in standard form. So it needs to be in a standard form categorical proposition to evaluate it using the rules. So all we have to do is change it into that, and that's not very hard. We have to add a copula, so we need an R there instead of the comma. And then the divorce rate, we have to include the word times, because down here in our conclusion, the word times is included, times the divorce rate decreases. So we would just add that word times, so the usage up here matches the usage down here in the conclusion, and we'd be in standard form. So all we did was add a copula R and then add the word times, so we have times the divorce rate decreases, and that would put it in standard form. Now once we've done that, we can actually symbolize that with M, D, and P. Marriage for M, decreases for D, and then present times for P. And so we have the bare bones argument structure, and this sort of structure makes it really easy to evaluate it using our 5 rules. So then we just look at the structure that we've translated from ordinary language, and we apply Rule 1. The middle term has to be distributed at least once. So the middle term is the M, and we know we have distribution in the subject slot here, so we conform to Rule 1. Rule 2 says if it's distributed in the conclusion, it must be distributed in the premises. We have distribution down here in our subject slot. We look up into our premises, and we find we have distribution because, remember, in an A-form categorical proposition, the subject term is distributed. So we've passed our first two rules. Rule 3 says you can't have two negatives in your premises. We don't have any negatives at all, so we're not violating that rule. Rule 4 says if you have a negative conclusion, you must have a negative in the premises. We don't have a negative in our conclusion, so we don't have to worry about Rule 4. And then Rule 5 says if you have universal quantifiers in your for your premises, you can't have a particular quantifier in your conclusion. So we do have two universal quantifiers for our premises, so our propositions are both universal. We don't have a particular conclusion. We also have a universal quantifier down here, so we're not violating the rule that governs the existential fallacy. So we would say that our ordinary language example here is a valid categorical syllogism. So I'll ask you to do something like that on the extra credit material, and so even if you can't get it exactly right, I can at least give you partial credit for that. Okay, so that's all the stuff for week 7. We're in the home stretch. Week 8 is our last week. We're going to do a little foray into scientific reasoning, and then you'll have critical thinking behind you. If you have any concerns or questions this week on the material, don't hesitate to contact me. See you next time.